All right, let's get started. So my name is David Brockman. I'm an associate professor of political science here at UC Berkeley. I'm also on the faculty executive committee and the incoming director of the Citron Center for the Public Opinion Research here at UC Berkeley, which is a center at UC Berkeley focused on the study of public opinion that was established recently by former students and colleagues and family of our Professor Jack Citron, who has been on the faculty here at UC Berkeley for a long time and kind of pioneered and helped pioneer the study of public opinion here at Berkeley. And I'm really pleased today to host this event we're calling Reshaping City Politics, ? Asian Voters' Demands for Change in San Francisco and Vancouver, and to have some really distinguished panelists. I know we'll have a lot to say about this interesting and important topic. The kind of impetus for this was a couple events that happened last year, where I thought there was some parallels between what we saw happening here in the Bay Area and in San Francisco in particular, and up in Vancouver. And I thought it'd be great to give folks from both communities a chance to talk more about what happened and also talk about maybe any similarities, differences, and what kind of joint lessons could be learned, as well as to think about whether these events potentially represent a trend and what that means for the future. So I'm just going to start off by giving just a few minutes of background for those who don't know what happened in San Francisco or Vancouver recently. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about that, and then I'm going to hand it over to our panelists. So just as background, so two amazing West Coast North American cities, San Francisco and Vancouver. Asian Americans and then Asian Canadians are a significant percent of the population in both of these cities, 34% of San Francisco residents, 45% of Vancouver residents, if you're using a broad definition of Asian. And as I mentioned, in both of these places, there was kind of, I think, events that really shocked the political establishment. First, in San Francisco, there were recalls of both the school board and our district attorney. So many San Francisco public schools, as background, I think for a long time had been classified officially as quote unquote low performing. And among many, there was a long-standing perception that the SF school board was kind of more focused on symbolic issues than trying to address this. So for example, there was a famous case that some might have heard about in 2019 or so, when the San Francisco School Board spent a lot of time debating renaming schools, changing murals in schools, removing a mural of Abraham Lincoln, I believed. And there was just a lot of perception that this focus was taking away the focus on trying to address some of the more systematic performance issues in those schools. So I think when some of these issues really came to a head in early 2021, when the SF school board ended merit-based admissions at Lowell High School, which was one of SF's, or I think SF's only magnet school, where you had to apply to get in, and it was merit-based, which was 57% Asian in terms of its student body. And so I think this really got the Asian community in San Francisco paying attention, and at the same time, there were comments that were perceived as racist made by a then school board commissioner, Allison Collins, that surfaced. And I think this kind of long-standing concerns, together with some of these events, helped spur a recall campaign, which ultimately received signatures from over 10% of the registered voters in the city. So if you just think about the kind of organization it takes to get that many folks to sign a recall petition. And what you see at public opinion data at the time, that white and Asian voters in particular, basically none of them thought the San Francisco School Board was doing a good job at managing the city's schools. But if you then look at what happened in the campaigns, I think the Asian community, and especially the Chinese American community in San Francisco, really was the energy behind this recall campaign. So we have Ann Su, who's on our panel today, here featured in the New York Times, in an article that talked about how organizers were using Chinese language messaging apps, as well as providing detailed instructions on how to fill out the ballots, to help organize the deployment of volunteers in Chinatown, where, as this article talks about, there were lion dances and drumming, exhorting residents to vote. And the data really bears out that turnout among those who requested Chinese language ballots was significantly higher than turnout overall. And you see this in the results as well, where just geographically, the western and southern parts of the city, which, as you can see on the right, are the parts of the city with the highest Asian share, are the parts of the city that voted most overwhelmingly to support this recall of these 3 school board members, all of which passed. There also last year, there was a successful recall of the district attorney in San Francisco. And if you look at data on views of crime and pessimism about the city, Asian voters in this poll from the SF Chronicle are kind of the most pessimistic about the future of San Francisco, especially rooted in concerns about safety and crime. So although safety and crime is one of the issues that comes up a lot for all voters in San Francisco, Asian voters were around 3 times as likely to name that as a big issue. There were also several instances where there were or perceived as kind of anti-Asian hate crimes that were committed in San Francisco, especially during the start of the pandemic. And District Attorney Chesa Boudin had made some comments that were interpreted as kind of offensive, and there was also a lot of criticism that he wasn't going to charge some of those suspects as aggressively as many wanted. So this also led to, I think, in part, a similar pattern of results where you see the results from the district attorney recall, which also passed, being again really propelled forward by neighborhoods that are overwhelmingly Asian. And I think it's interesting that in Vancouver, although the details are a little bit different, you see some of these same issues recurring in some ways. So in Vancouver, although I know less about this, I live in San Francisco, so I saw all this up close and personal. Reading some of the news coverage of Vancouver, you see some similar themes. Anti-Asian hate crimes in Vancouver. There was a Bloomberg article calling Vancouver the anti-Asian hate crime capital of North America. And the numbers here are just really shocking in terms of what Vancouver experienced with the onset of the pandemic. Vancouver also is experiencing, much like San Francisco, a huge problem around the affordability of the housing market and the housing crisis. So Vancouver is second only to San Francisco in terms of the unaffordability of its housing. And so then comes in a candidate that runs on trying to address some of these issues. And just to give you a sense, I want to show you an ad for Ken Sim and the city council candidates he was running with for his party, ABC Vancouver, to give you a sense of what was happening in that election of October of last year.
Hey Ken, so what's this all about?
Well, Laura, I'm running for mayor of Vancouver, and I'm putting together a new team. A team that's going to fight for sustainability, safety, and affordability. A team that will work hard to build a Vancouver where people feel safe in their own neighborhoods again, where families can afford to build a life together, protect our environment, and support small businesses and emerging industries. Can we count on your support on October 15th?
You have me at sustainability. Tell me, what's the name of this new team?
So that was an ad for ABC, and you can see some of the same themes that have risen in San Francisco coming up in that ad. And the results here, I think it's fair to say, really shocked the political establishment of Vancouver, where Ken Sim not only was the first Asian Canadian to win the mayoralty in Vancouver, but he defeated the incumbent by almost 2-1, which is, I think, just a shocking result. And again, when you look at the map of the results, and we have Mr. Sim's campaign manager here to tell us about some of the polling as well, you again see that the Asian community, especially the Chinese community in Vancouver, was a big part of the story here. So I think it's interesting to think about these cities, and also on the panel a little bit, we might zoom out a little bit and think about Asian American public opinion overall. We see that Asian Americans in the US context, for example, do tend to be more towards the left. In the US on average, Asian voters, if you look at public opinion on a lot of issues such as healthcare or abortion or policing, tend to be more similar to kind of Democratic voters in general, and more liberal than white voters. But I think some of the trends in these cities suggest that the story might be a little more complex. And so I'm really excited to welcome our panelists today to hear more about what happened in these cities and what the lessons are and how this, what lessons scholarship might have for this. So first we have Lorraine Lowe, who's a community leader in the Chinese community in Vancouver. Everyone I reached out to in Vancouver said, you've just got to talk to Lorraine. So I'm really excited to hear what she has to say from the kind of grassroots perspective. We have Kareem Allam, who was the campaign manager for Ken Sim and ABC's campaign, and is also now a partner at Fairview Strategy. We have Ann Sue, who was appointed not only one of the leaders in the school board recall efforts, but was appointed to the SF School Board after the successful recalls, is a founder of the Bert Sue Academy, and most importantly, a UC Berkeley MBA and MS graduate. So we're very happy to have you here. And finally, Professor Neil Malhotra at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, who has studied public opinion in the US and especially Asian American public opinion. So we're very excited to have you all join us, and thank you so much again for joining us. If it's all right, I think first I'd love to turn it over to Lorraine, especially I think our US listeners in particular are just fascinated to hear more about kind of what happened on the ground in Vancouver. So Lorraine, I'd love to hear if you could just tell us more about what was the Chinese community in Vancouver feeling in the months and years before last year's election, and your position as a community leader, kind of what were you hearing and experiencing?
So, the real fest started to escalate between 2020, 22 during the pandemic. There were several high-profile assaults on Chinese seniors. There were several attacks on our cultural institutions at the peak of the pandemic. That was quite concerning. And, to be honest, the vandalism, that sort of stuff's been happening in Chinatown before the pandemic. So public safety issue, that was always an issue. But, it was always contained in Chinatown in the downtown core. And at the time, we had a mayor that was very focused on a different agenda, and his focus was definitely not helping Chinatown. So our needs were dismissed. And, sadly, as you pointed out, we earned the reputation of being the Asian hate capital, as you pointed out. And, media started to pick up on it. And by early 2022, many of the social media channels, the Asian news circuits, many originating from like Oakland, California, like in San Fran, OC, they were all sharing horrific stories of seeing elders being beaten, and it's across the nation in New York. But you know what? I think the silver lining in all this is that through these stories, it really connected us and inspired us to all mobilize and speak up. And, the Asian community, it's always been like a silent majority. We all were under the radar because we're not loud, and, we don't mean to, it doesn't mean that we're not aware of what's going on and happening. And I like to call it like a art of war activism, subdue the enemy without fighting. And, as a community leader, that sort of thing kind of fueled me to even make it more known to everybody out there what was going on. The more they attacked us, the more support it drew from other people, like other communities, Filipino, Southeast Asian. People just started mobilizing. I got in touch with a bunch of folks from Seattle, built those relationships, shared similar stories, sentiments, then, reached out to San Fran. The network there has been amazing. And, to be honest, we were all watching very closely on the recall of the DA and the whole school board unfold. And it was really quite assuring to see that things were finally turning around for us. And, we're seeing this shift over to common sense.
Yeah, thanks for that. I want to next ask, Kareem. So this is where the kind of the electoral and political part starts. And, defeating an incumbent mayor is always hard. To beat an incumbent by almost 2-1, I think is almost unheard of. And so I'd be curious to hear more from you about kind of what you think made the campaign successful in general, and especially with respect to your outreach to the Chinese community in Vancouver.
Yeah, so I'll start off by saying a couple things. First of all, I got to meet Lorraine on this campaign quite early on, and the bond and the relationship that we built has been incredible in helping educate me and help drive my understanding of the complexities of the issues and be able to pull together the platform that was ultimately going to be successful and get elected. But I also want to acknowledge Anne, that New York Times article that you referenced came across my desk really early on, and we took a lot of cues from that to help build up our platform. So a lot of the things that you referenced in your research and data and your polling were starting to show up in our own internal polling as issues that were not just significant concern to the Chinese community, but also significant concern broadly across the city of Vancouver. To talk about why our campaign fundamentally was successful, context in politics is everything. Politics in Vancouver is very, very progressive. Winnipeg and Vancouver are both the heart and soul and the foundation of the founding of the labor movement in Canada. Labor has always played an oversized role in our elections here in the city of Vancouver. but also the city of Vancouver has been the epicenter of some of the largest, most significant social activist policies, organizations, and wins in the country. I often like to remind people that aren't from here that Greenpeace was founded in British Columbia. So that gives you a flavor for the sense of what defines our politics here. That coalition between Social Democrats and Labor has been quite impressive in its ability to win elections. For example, for the last 14 years before this election, that coalition has delivered 14 years of successive governments at City Hall. It elected 9 out of 11 MLAs that we sent to Victoria to represent us provincially, and 8 out of 8 MPs that we sent to Ottawa to represent us federally. So you can't win an election if in Vancouver unless you're able to tap into to that voter base. So the challenge for us as a campaign was, how do we remain authentic to our political base, which is represented by people like Lorraine, but also come up with a platform that doesn't offend, but instead attracts people from the political left. So as Lorraine described, one of the top issues was public safety. We ran a campaign on hiring 100 new police officers and 100 mental health workers. Since 1978, Vancouver's had this CAR 87 program that twins a police officer with a mental health worker, and a person in distress then gets health care. They get sent to the hospital rather than handcuffs. And so we're able to find this policy balance where people could see that we were taking a very serious stand on crime, but one that the political left could accept as well. The way that transpired in terms of communications, when you're running a radio ad, we're going to hire 100 new cops and 100 new nurses. The right side of the coalition that we built just heard 100 cops, and the left side of the coalition just heard 100 mental health nurses. So everyone could hear what they wanted to hear. And we duplicated that 15 or 16 different times with our platform. When it came to the issue of on school board, where the previous school board had gotten rid of honors programs, yes, we communicated and we talked about restoring those honors programs for those top 5-10% of students. But at the same time, we also talked about enhancing funding for the bottom 5 or 10% of students as well, creating more individualization in the education system. Fundamentally, the impact of all that is we were able to appeal more to that progressive base than the progressive previous mayor, Kennedy Stewart, was able to do. His vote collapsed. It came to us. And we were able to thread that very, very, very tight needle to build this broad-based coalition. In terms of the Chinese community, I want to be deliberately provocative because this is generally how we saw our approach to it. There is no Chinese community in Vancouver. You wouldn't go to Beijing, Shanghai, or Taipei and talk about the Chinese communities there because they're just fundamentally Chinese cities. And Vancouver is precisely just that, a Chinese city. You showed a number that 45% of Vancouverites are Asian. I think that number is much, much higher. I don't think the Stats Can data asks the question the right way. So beyond the fact that 50% of the population is Asian, Vancouver also has some of the highest rates of mixed marriages in North America. I think 20 to 25% of marriages in the city are mixed race. And the vast majority of those mixed race marriages involve one person in that marriage being Asian. So you might be a white mom or a white dad, but your children are Chinese. So you can't underestimate the demographic argument. But what's also missed in what makes Vancouver a Chinese city is the oversized role the Chinese community plays in the business community, arts, culture, every aspect of society. And that has shaped how European voters in the city of Vancouver also view the city, view the public policy process. And we see evidence of that in the sense of how European voters in Vancouver, because of the Chinese influence, might view issues differently than other Canadian voters in other cities where there isn't as large of a Chinese population. So the fundamental impact of acknowledging that Vancouver is a Chinese city meant that our campaign really was addressing the Chinese community's concerns directly and authentically. One of the reasons why political campaigns often fail in attracting racialized voters is it's an afterthought. You start working on your main issues and your main narratives, and then it's, okay, these are the 2 or 3 policies we're going to implement to try to get Filipino voters on or Black voters on or whatever. The fact that at the core of our campaign was that acknowledgement that Vancouver is a Chinese city, meant that for the first time in history, there was an authentic, direct campaign aimed right at the heart of issues that mattered to Asian voters. And I think that's why we were successful there as well.
I think super fascinating. I'm excited to dig more into that. I want to first turn it over to Anne, though. So Anne, thanks again for joining us. You were a key leader in the school board recall, and then were, of course, later appointed to fill one of the seats vacated by the recalled school board members after the recall succeeded. And I mean, if you just think about that number, gathering that many signatures alone, over 10% of the city's registered voters, was an incredible accomplishment, let alone winning the election. So just for context for folks, because I know people feel like, oh, California has recalls all the time. So those were the first recall elections that even got to the ballot in San Francisco since 1983, and the first successful one in over 100 years, since 1914. So it's just an amazing accomplishment. And I'd be curious to hear more about how that movement kind of came together and what lessons you take away from it for the community in San Francisco and also other communities across North America.
Thanks for the opportunity to be here. At first, I want to say that how the movement came together, I was actually not involved from the very beginning in the signature gathering phase. I came in at the end and pushed it over on the election where we don't know if you have the stats, but the 3 recalled school board members, they were recalled with 76%, 74%, and 72%. Because there's 3 people, you got to vote 3 times. Yes to recall, Allison Collins, Gabriela Lopez, and the Maliga. So Allison Collins got 76% saying yes, she should be recalled, and then 74 and 72%. So that vote was even overwhelming. No doubt about it that every precinct in San Francisco voted to recall all 3 school board members. But coming back to your question of the signature gathering, how that came about was in early, I'd say February of 2021. A couple who are each have their children. They became a new couple. They moved to San Francisco. The man had 2 kids in San Francisco public schools. The woman had 2 or 3 kids in the peninsula, not in San Francisco, in private schools. The private school kids went to school and the public school kids could not go back to school during that Zoom year. And that's what drove this couple, saying that it's really unfair. And one of the sons of the San Francisco was really experiencing some mental health challenges. So they felt extremely unfair. It's that Siva Raj and Autumn Lucian. You may have heard that name, Siva and Autumn. They're the ones who launched the signature gathering. And for 6 months, from February to August of 2021, there were volunteers all over the city of San Francisco gathering signatures. And many of those volunteers were Chinese, Asian. Okay, they were all over the city and gathered. I think they required 55,000 or so, and ultimately they got over 80,000. So by September, all those signatures were carried in boxes into the elections office in the city hall, and they counted them throughout some whatever, but they got enough to schedule the special election for February of 2022. I came on the scene. You may have seen there was a viral video by one of the volunteers, signature gatherers. His name is Kit Lam. Did you remember, David? You remember seeing him?
Oh yeah, I
do. Was gathering signatures.
Tell folks in the audience, yeah.
At a farmer's market. He was there every Sunday farmer's market just down the street where I live. And one day, some guy came and grabbed a bunch of signature pages and ran away. And Kit used to work for the inspector's office or something in Hong Kong. He chased down the guy, literally chased down. And there happened to be like a reporter who ran with him and videoed the whole episode of Kit just saying, you took my signatures, and would not back down. The guy was trying to deny it in the beginning, and then finally at the end, he just took it out of car and gave it to Kit or something. So that video went viral and helped us gather more signatures to recall, just to see how the progressive left is just trying to kill this signature gathering effort of the recall of the school board. So anyway, they got enough signatures, scheduled it for February. I came on the scene in November. So we say Kit did the first part and I did the second part. We worked as a tag team, and I came on the scene and helped form a Chinese API voter outreach task force, because we realized that Asians are a third of the city. Just Chinese is a quarter of the city, but the voter registration and voter turnout rate is much lower than other communities in San Francisco. And this being an education issue, it is really very, very important. You don't even need to say that. It's an important issue to the Asian community. So we were intentional, and this task force just targeted Chinese media. We didn't pay attention to any of the English-speaking SF Chronicle, whatever. We didn't care about them at all. We just targeted on WeChat, Chinese TV, radio, newspaper ads. And we came on as a task force of a handful of people with no funds. But Siva and Autumn, that group had raised funds for the recall, and another group had raised funds. But neither groups had any Asian contacts or team. So we positioned ourselves as that team for them and just went to them for the funds to place the ads and do whatever outreach we needed. So we were not officially any group at all, not a 501c, not anything, but just a group of people that could do this. And the funds came from those two registered PACs, or whatever you call them. All right, so we worked with them, and the results were overwhelmingly great. Everybody was elated, and then really acknowledged not just the volunteers, but the actual voters who were Asian that voted for education being important. And the two main issues that really got to them, one was the Lowe High School merit-based admission being taken away. It was seen as a direct assault on the Asians at Lowe, saying there are too many of you, you got to let other people in. And that just did not seem fair, that we're here because we had the grades, we have, it just did not seem fair to the Asians. That was one. And the other was the racist tweets by Allison Collins that surfaced that really were quite racist. That really irked the Asian community here, and we turned out and voted to recall them. And afterwards, the whole momentum actually carried on to recall the DA, because safety is the other very important issue for the Asian community in San Francisco. And to this day, education and safety are the two that really can energize the Asian community. Other issues like, yes, homelessness, housing, and all that other issues, I think relative to education and safety are less issues that can galvanize the Asian community in San Francisco. So that was how the recall happened.
Thanks for that background. So Neil, I'd love to bring you into this. So as a scholar of public opinion, so what we've heard so far, and I think in all these answers, really stress the role of activists and organizations, but also the role of public opinion. And you've done a lot of research and I know a lot of thinking about public opinion among Asian Americans. So I'd just love to hear your reactions to some of what you've heard. What if this resonates with what research on Asian American public opinion more generally has found? What do you feel like is kind of in need of more study here?
Yeah, these are really fascinating stories, and I'm especially really interested to hear the Canadian perspective, since I don't know it that well. So that was terrific. I think what everyone is saying resonates with a few things we know about Asian American public opinion broadly. So one, I think, thing that's interesting is that a lot of the races that people have been talking about, at least in the US, are nonpartisan. I know Canada has a very complicated party system and breakoffs. I'm not going to get into that. But I think a big thing is that when you recall these people, when you're winning these mayoral elections, it doesn't say the word Republican on the ballot. And I think that's actually very key, that these tend to be, at least in San Francisco, intra-party disputes. And one thing that I think is interesting is that I'm skeptical that this might translate nationally, because the National Republican Party is very different than what I would call the moderate Democratic Party in these cities. So I think there are things that the nationwide Republican Party is doing, like stances on pro-life and other kind of issues that may be actually kind of turning Asian American voters off. The second thing I would mention is that my research personally has argued that a big reason why you see this puzzle of why Asian Americans look a lot more like Hispanic and Black voters on national voting is that the Republican Party has historically made them feel socially excluded. And among the Asian American population, this is actually very important because unlike African Americans have a long history in the country, Hispanic Americans are adjacent geographically, but Asian Americans have always been tagged with the other. So anybody who makes them feel like the other or foreign is kind of socially excluded from the national fabric is looked down upon. What's interesting is the left is who's been socially excluding Asian Americans over the last few years. So to build on some of the things Anne said, what they did with Lowell, it is actually like very different than what they've done in other places. So Thomas Jefferson in Virginia is very similar to Lowell, but they kind of did like an affirmative action policy there. Whereas with Lowell, they completely eliminated merit-based admissions. That's basically telling a group of people, we don't want any of you coming to, so it's not like, let's try to balance it from 70% to like 60, 50. It's just like, get out of this school, right? Similarly, with the crime issues that Anne was talking about, like if you feel targeted based on your race, that's going to make you feel socially excluded. So that's going to affect your voting, et cetera. So I guess if you kind of extend it nationally, I would say that the advice or lesson that Republicans can learn from this is that if you double down on social exclusion, you're not going to be able to attract this group. But if you double down on inclusion, this is an opportunity to expand your polling.
Thanks for that. I have a few questions. I think also I'll just say the audience, you can use the Q&A feature. We welcome your questions. And before I get into those, would any of the panelists like to kind of jump in to react to what you heard the other panelists say, things that resonated with you or you'd like to add to?
I could just add to what Neil had said that there is definitely in the Canadian political system a very complex federal party system. We have 5 parties represented in our House of Commons. We have 3 in our provincial legislature. But yes, our municipal politics too does sort of transcend those federal allegiances as well too. One of the things that we attempted to do is to try to build a coalition that crossed these federal party lines. In our polling at the end of the campaign reflected that 60% of our voters came from the federal Liberal Party, which is the centrist party in Canada, 20% from the Conservatives, and then 20% from Labour. So we were successful ultimately at the end in threading that needle through to build the widest possible coalitions that we could. Some of these issues that we deal with municipally, they're not really as ideological as federal and provincial issues. You're dealing with potholes and garbage and crime, and fixing a pothole or not is not a left or right issue. So I think that theme that you articulated for what occurs in U.S. elections is very congruent to Canadian ones and at the municipal level.
I do want to say that, I don't know if you saw, David, you saw a relatively recent CNN story about the Asians, or at least the Chinese, moving more conservative in San Francisco. Did you see that, David?
I remember seeing the headline. I didn't read the story.
It was a little video.
Okay.
I know both of the Chinese people featured. Neil, did you see that one? yeah, is actually indicating a general trend within the United States, across the United States, of the Asian, or at least the Chinese voters becoming more conservative.
So we have a lot of questions from the audience, and I have some I'd love to ask as well. I think we just addressed this a little bit, but I'm curious if you have anything more to add. So we have a question from Jason McDaniel, who is a professor of political science at SF State University. And thanks for being in the audience, Jason. So Jason asks, one potentially important difference between SF and Vancouver is this use of local only political parties in Vancouver compared to the nonpartisan elections in SF. And I'd be curious, we talked about this a little bit, but if you have anything to add on kind of how that played into this.
I wouldn't say there's nonpartisan in San Francisco. Everybody's a Democrat. Everybody has to be a Democrat.
It's similar in Vancouver. The vast majority of voters here are liberals or New Democrats. And Justin Trudeau, our prime minister, has moved the Liberal Party further to the left than some of his predecessors. So yeah, I would say that in Vancouver and San Francisco for sure, there's a lot of truth to the fact that those two cities are very, very, very progressive cities, and so there's definitely congruence there on that.
But I would say there's, at least in San Francisco, by the results of the two recalls, the Board of Ed recall and the DA recall, we can see that the ultra progressives are maybe losing hold on that. And it is the Asian voters who are leaning more conservative. Even on the Democratic scale is a little more conservative, especially when it comes to education and safety. Those are the two key issues.
So I'd like to look at it as not so much left and right. I think it's just common sense, like what was happening in Chinatown, how we were being ignored. I mean, the issue of public safety was a serious one. And, they didn't want to acknowledge that. And I felt that, being a nonprofit organization, we are a cultural organization in Chinatown, we're nonpartisan, but, we had to address what was going on, and that was the truth. So, the way I see things is that everybody's not so much leaning towards the right pendulum swing. I think it's just more common sense and getting back to like reality and not ideology. And I think people are starting to see that.
But the common sense, there's actually a common sense party in California now. It's it's trying to be the third party. And nationally is the Forward Party with Andrew Yang, who ran for president.
Oh, yes.
But they formed a alliance, and in California it's called the Common Sense Party. But really, these common sense issues are being attacked by the progressive left. Right? They should not be partisan. They are just common sense issues, but they're being painted by the progressive left as extremes, which they are not. But that's how politics in San Francisco works, as I learned since I was completely new to this.
So one other question that's come up in the Q&A a few times, and I was going to ask about this as well. So, in my opening, I kind of talked about Asian voters broadly, and I think a lot of the focus we've had in this conversation has been really especially focusing on Chinese voters. And I think there's, in political science, we hear and talk a lot about the idea of diversity within communities. And of course, like the Asian community, of course, is made up of many people of many different ethnic backgrounds. But then even within those groups, obviously, there's a lot of diversity of thoughts and experiences. And so I'd be curious to hear more about how those kind of differences played out over the kind of course of the campaign and these movements.
I can try to jump in and address some of that. Yes, the Chinese community, the Asian community in Vancouver is not homogenous. It's very diverse, very significant ranges in terms of income demographics as well. We're probably 50-50 Mandarin Cantonese. The Taiwanese community, it's shrunk over time, but still quite present, still quite active in the city. You have Chinese voters who are descendants of people who have been in British Columbia since the 1800s, and you have very recent new arrivals. But the common experience of the increase of anti-Asian hate spanned right across all those lines and all those demographics. But one of the things too that was also interesting, that one of the things that we started seeing in our polling towards the end of the election is, maybe 2-3 weeks out, it showed that we were 5-6 points ahead of Kennedy Stewart in the election. And then in the last 2 weeks, there's this hockey stick curve of support that started building up. Part of it was the collapse of the center right vote into our coalition. Part of it was the collapse of the Labor vote into our coalition. But one of the things that we were starting to see is other Asian voters, Filipinos, Koreans, also South Asians and Black voters starting to roll into the coalition. And it raised some interesting questions of why is this happening? And we didn't really fully understand it till after the election that a lot of people were feeling that they'd been shut out of the political process. I'm Egyptian, or my parents are Egyptian. We're never going to elect an Egyptian person if the Chinese community with 50% of the vote can't elect a Chinese person to be mayor. So there's this growing sense of we need the Chinese community to be successful in order for our communities to eventually be successful and be represented as well. And so there's this weird undercurrent of support and rallying around the Chinese community from other racialized groups that was really unanticipated and really, I think, accentuated that victory to the point where every person we ran won the election.
Okay, we have a lot of different questions coming in here, so I'm going to try to sort through these because now we've got almost a dozen. So one question that came in was kind of about this angle related to what in political science we call descriptive representation, which is the presence of people in office who are like of the background of voters. So we talk about kind of the election of women. We, for a long time with political science, and I've done work on this, have especially studied the election of Black politicians. Obviously, that's a one part of the story of Ken Sim's victory here. That's one part of the recall elections, having Anne, eventually be on the Board of Education. At the same time, I think the story is a little complex. And Anne, for example, I'm sure you could probably speak to this a little bit. The supervisor election that just happened in the Sunset, there was a Chinese American who represented the Sunset District who was voted out of office and was replaced by a white politician, Joel Engardio, but one who was involved in a lot of these recall campaigns, and I think stressed a lot of these themes. So I think the role of descriptive representation here is I think it's easy to see this as like a straightforward narrative of more representation, but how that actually plays out can be quite complicated. So I'd be curious to hear more about kind of the complicated side of this issue of how people think about the idea of kind of having someone that looks like them kind of represent them and how that kind of interplays with these issues.
I'll jump in to say that I was a typical Chinese American voter in San Francisco. You saw a Chinese name, you ticked it. It didn't matter what, you didn't know anything about that person. You saw a Chinese name, you just checked it. So to the tune that I don't even know who I voted for the school board in like 2018. But through the school board recall and through the DA recall, I would say just in the last year and a half, I think the Chinese community is starting to pay a little more attention. And you just said District 4, which is the Sunset District in San Francisco, it's overwhelmingly Chinese and Asian. That's where Lowe High School is situated. They have had Chinese supervisor for the 4. Each supervisor gets 2 terms, and then at least 3 or 4 past supervisors have all been in Chinese. And this one was an incumbent, his 2nd term, and it was unheard of to unseat this Chinese supervisor incumbent. This district has, long since 2000, when it became district-wide election instead of citywide, this district had been represented by a Chinese supervisor. So this is the first time that a non-Chinese person, although his partner is, and actually he's gay and has a Chinese partner. So being non-Chinese and gay, unseating a Chinese in that district is just outrageous. So that tells you that the Chinese residents of that district and across the San Francisco are now being a little more discerning, not just a Chinese name on the ballot that they would just check. So that is a good sign that people are starting to pay a little more attention to see who actually represents their values. And we actually in San Francisco and in California, we don't have that few Asian or Chinese politicians, right? We have lots of them, but I've heard comments, many comments saying that, they may look like us, but they don't represent our values. And this particular supervisor race really showed that people are now starting to realize who does represent your values. And even if that person is not Chinese, it's fine. So yeah, I think that's a good sign of more educated voters. Otherwise, those votes can be manipulated very easily.
I'd say that we had a very representative slate. Not only do we elect the first Chinese mayor in the city's history, elected the first Mandarin councillor in the city's history, we elected the first turban Sikh on park board, the first Sikh woman on our park board. We elected the first Indigenous park board commissioner. We elected the first Punjabi woman on our school board. We elected the first Mandarin candidate on our school board. We elected the first Taiwanese candidate on our school board. We had a lot of firsts. We had 3 LGBTQ candidates on our team. So our slate was very representative of what the city looked like. But in addition to that, and to your point, David, or I think the point that you're trying to drive at is policy and competence matter. People have to feel that these faces will have a voice, and that when they do exercise that voice, that they will be able to drive the outcomes that are expected, or drive the outcomes that are promised in their platforms. So there is this importance as we start to look forward, as we want to see more diverse people in politics enter. It's where are we finding the best and the brightest in our society and encouraging them to run into politics, because what in Canada, and I can't speak to the US, we are seeing a decline in the level and the caliber of candidates entering public office. And if we are going to continue to have success, we are going to have to work a lot harder at finding, the best in academia, the best in business, the best in arts and culture and society to come up and step into those roles. And as politics becomes more toxic with social media, it's becoming harder and harder and harder. And it's also even manifesting itself in the people who are running campaigns or agreeing to be political staffers or people going into the civil service. The toxicity issue is really starting to deteriorate the level and the quality of candidates we're attracting. And so you are 100% right that beyond just being physically representative, the competence part is becoming more and more important.
I'd like to also add that there were other candidates that were running on the other side that, were of people of color, Asian descent. But I think what ABC really nailed down was they were clear and concise with what their party stood for. So, they went into, the ballot box and ticked off all ABC. I mean, there was a reason for that. It wasn't just because this person identified as Asian. It was completely the fact that these guys, they knew what they were doing. They were going door to door, and they were getting a very clear message across to all ethnic groups, like across the board. And if you look at the data sample that was polled, a lot of there was a heavy presence in Sunset, which is a community that's like predominantly East Indo-Canadians, and they dominated that riding there. So, I think a lot of people do think, okay, well, you guys ran a lot of the candidates from BIPOC communities like the Southeast Asian, the Chinese, but there was pretty much a very clear platform that got across to these groups that said, okay, ABC was the way to go, because the numbers were astounding. It was a juggernaut, as somebody put it.
Just to echo, I think the question is really interesting on the gaps or similarity of descriptive and substantive representation. And I actually don't really know of any research on this, but David, you've done a lot of great research arguing that a lot of representatives kind of overstate the conservatism of their constituents, and it was kind of nationally. I wonder if you actually have a reverse phenomenon in California, in some of these areas, where the assembly members might overstate or overperceive the liberalism of their constituents. So there's many Asian American representatives in the California State Assembly and the California State Senate. It would just be fascinating to interview them and see like what they think their constituents actually believe, and then compare it, because it's very possible there's just a lot of misperception issues, that they actually might think they're being representative, even if they might not.
Yeah, I think it's as I'll editorialize and say, as a resident of San Francisco myself, I think one of the issues and challenges in the city's politics is, you have a very rich landscape of organizations purporting to represent different communities. I mean, it's great. It's great for communities to be organized. The question though is, like, we have a lot of political science research as well saying that, even within disadvantaged communities, you often have, the hierarchies within those communities show up in terms of who participates in those organizations, who runs them, et cetera. And so I think you do have phenomena where you have organizations that kind of purport to speak for a whole community, but actually it might be run by, say, like just the business owners from that community, or maybe it's just run by the people who, have like the most extreme political views from that community, or the ones that get involved. And so, I think this, elections like this can, in some sense, partly like serve a function to have like politicians and just political, leaders and elites more generally to realize, like, oh, like maybe we're not actually reading the electorate right here, because they all voted for XYZ. And so I think that's it gets to something that I'd be curious to dive into a little bit, which is and maybe I can just ask the question now, to just kind of hear more about to what extent you all feel like this is a trend. Like, what will the legacy of these elections be? In and of itself, did they send a message that's going to have an effect? Do you feel like there's kind of organizing work that was done here that's going to have an effect, or is this just like a flash in the pan? So we had, for example, a question asking, how much of this is just about, 2020, there was the George Floyd protest, there was COVID. Is this something that kind of we're going to go back to business as usual, or if not, like what is the long-term kind of implications of some of what happened last year?
Just on that Neil question to you, David, I think it's always been a dream of mine to run a campaign in the United States. So if you want to put that test to theory, just find me a candidate to go run a campaign in San Francisco. I couldn't imagine having more fun time than doing that. But in terms of just, is this the new trend? Is this the new normal? Having run campaigns now for 25 years and working very closely with the Chinese community, you see this come in waves. And so in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a significant ramp up in engagement, particularly with the Cantonese community, recent Hong Kong immigrants. As they've gotten older, the younger generation of Cantonese people haven't gotten as engaged as their parents and their grandparents had. And so we saw this decline, but now we're starting to see this resurgence again. So these things tend to occur in waves, and in just in terms of my personal firsthand experience, I wouldn't have numbers to that. But yeah, I remember at the beginning of this campaign, reaching out to some of the members of the Cantonese community that I would have worked with when I was in my 20s. I'm like, okay, so who do we talk to now to, try to get things going? And, the lists are getting smaller. We're getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So I do suspect that in the next two elections, you will see a ramp up in engagement and activity from the Chinese community. But it'll be generational, and you might end up seeing this downward swing at some point.
I want to say I agree with that, because in San Francisco, at least in the 70s and 80s, there was an influx of immigrants from Hong Kong, Taiwan. Mostly the Hong Kong ones stayed in San Francisco. and they were quite politically active, championing for bilingual education, education-related issues. So they formed Chinese for Affirmative Action. They formed, a number of nonprofit as well as political organization to champion the civil rights of this whole new influx of Chinese immigrants. So they were quite active, my late husband included, in the 70s and 80s. But then that generation, they got into their 30s and 40s and went on to their professional lives, whether it's lawyers, businessmen, or whatever, and they became less politically active. So probably in the 90s and 2000s, less. And then recently, just because of the education issue, I think that maybe we're re-engaging them, but I tend to agree that it has gone in cycles and probably will go in cycles, and that's actually quite Chinese in its yin and yang, and things go in cycles and circles.
And I have to totally agree with that. I think, in our culture, we're upbringing, it's rooted in rich family values, the self-pride, respect for authority, non-confrontational, and we place a heavy focus on academics. So, with that being said, we never see ourselves as the victim. We've always forged ahead, got on our way just to kind of charge forward and be just that. But, with everything that's happening right now, I think you're going to see more people going back to those values, because a lot of the things that are happening in the school system, like here in Vancouver, I could say, I have 2 younger children, so they've been through this. And, it's just this shift moving away from traditional family values, and it's becoming a little bit more loose, and people are becoming lost. And, they get attracted to the social contagion now, where there's this whole world of the internet and, having the space now. And I think we need to kind of pull back. And the good thing about our culture and how I'm raising my kids is to make sure, hey, you come to me. If you want to, have advice, come to me first. I think there needs to be a shift back into rooted the social moral fabric and the family values and the traditions. So I suspect to see a shift also, as well as what Kareem was mentioning.
So I'll offer a bit of a different take, mainly just to offer a different take, not because I necessarily agree, but just to get a different perspective. So I actually think you can overlearn from these 2 cities. I think they're very weird cities on a lot of dimensions. And I think the situations in these cities are somewhat abnormal. And I think you have just, at least in San Francisco, I think you had some very extreme positions and rhetoric taken that may not be replicating, and people can learn. And so they can learn that okay, there was this revolt, so we should moderate in the future. I'd also say that I think if you look at national trends, there's trends that work in opposite directions that make it very hard to predict the future. So as an example, the 2020 presidential election was slightly racially depolarized from the 2016 election. And if you were to ask me in the day of after the 2016 election, will 2020 racially depolarize? I would have said no, and I would have been totally wrong. So now what's going to happen in 2024? Are you going to get more racial depolarization? I don't know, because what are the dimensions of polarization that are increasing in the US? So you have more educational polarization and you have more regional polarization. And this actually works against Asian Americans becoming more Republican, because they tend to be more education, more urban, which are also where the Democratic Party is increasing in strength. So I think if you actually were to go into the Republican National Committee headquarters right now, they probably see a lot more potential in Latino voters than they do in Asian American voters, because all the dimensions of polarization are working in their favor in that community.
I would say that would be a mistake for the Republican Party to not pay attention, because really, as Lorraine just said, traditional values of the Asians really align more with Republicans' traditional values. When you get down to it, at least in education in San Francisco, I think we are 1/3 of our school-age children are in private schools. That is very condemning of the public school system here in San Francisco. That might be the highest percentage of private school kids in any city. So I would let's say the Republican Party should pay a little more attention to the Asians because they're swinging more conservative.
So I want to bring another issue that it's come up in a couple of the Q&As, including from Richard Johnston at UBC. Thanks for joining us. And also was in the ad that I played from Ken-Sim we haven't talked about yet, which is the issue of housing. So, Anne mentioned that in SF, it is an issue, but, we saw in those poll results from the SF Chronicle that, issues of housing and homelessness are kind of not rated as highly in public opinion data among Asian voters in San Francisco relative to other voters. Whereas, my sense from a few hundred miles away, looking at the Ken-Sim campaign is that was a really major theme. So I'd be curious to hear more about that. And I also know that there was the kind of a backstory of policies that in Vancouver and in British Columbia and Canada that were really trying to target this perception of kind of foreign buyers as well. So I'd be curious to hear just more about how those issues played out as part of the campaign up in Vancouver.
Yeah, I think, the affordability question has been quite dominant. Fairview, one of the things that we do at my firm is we're a polling firm. And I don't do too much polling these days. That's done mostly by my partner. But I remember when I was earlier in my career doing a lot of research, it didn't matter whether it was a municipal, provincial, or federal election. In the late 90s, early 2000s, the number one issue in Canada was healthcare. And that persisted for 10 years. And then it became the environment that persisted for 7 years. And then it's now become housing affordability and municipal, provincial, federal, doesn't matter what part of the country it is, housing affordability is the number one issue. The takeaway from these trends is that the public generally views these issues as so large that they're not solvable. You can't win an election on housing affordability. You can lose one if you don't have a good plan and can't show good progress, but you can't win an election on these issues. So we never saw this as something that we had to do to win the election. We just had to come up with a good, sound approach to this to show that we were going to be able to make progress on it. We saw the housing affordability problem in one lens. In the city of Vancouver, our approvals and permitting process is so long. It could take 6 to 12 years to get a tower built and approved in the city of Vancouver. So we can fight World War I and World War II in shorter time than it takes to approve a high-rise residential construction building in Vancouver, and that's just absolutely outrageous. We have a huge supply problem. One of the interesting things pulling this up into a national debate in a Canadian perspective is if you think of the two biggest problems that we have in Canadian society today, one is the gray tsunami. People are aging out. We don't have enough workers coming in. So what does the Prime Minister announce? He announces that he's going to up the number of immigrants coming to the country to 500,000 a year. The second biggest issue we have in this country is housing affordability. Well, we're not building 500,000 homes a year in this country. So we're making the problem worse to solve the other problem. And so there's this weird policy nexus where to solve one of our biggest national issues, we have to deliberately make the other one worse. So I don't know how in the long term that gets resolved, but our promise in this campaign was to do everything we could to dramatically speed up the permitting times and try to get more supply on. But at every level, federal, provincial, and municipal, this housing affordability issue, it's not going to resolve itself just through one election at a municipal level. It's going to require a tremendous amount of re-engineering our legislative processes for housing. In terms of the foreign buyers stuff, it was a bigger issue, I think, in 2018, 2019, 2020. I think it's been well established now that foreign buyers have not negatively impact housing affordability in Vancouver. I'm sure there's some people out there that still believe that, but the data clearly contradicts that. But again, that perception that foreign buyers were the ones that were driving up housing affordability, contributed to the rise in anti-Asian hate. And I think a lot of effort has gone in from academia, particularly UBC has done a really good job at this, in deconstructing and demonstrating that feeling is wrong. And I'm glad that they did that work, because it was important.
Yeah, I think housing is a very underrated issue. I agree with Anne, that's probably not on the top of mind right now, but that doesn't mean that the party that doesn't win housing is eventually not going to win. And so I do believe that the party that wins housing and figures it out is going to be very well positioned. And a lot of my research has been on feelings of social exclusion, and so people can feel excluded in different ways. So one way you can feel excluded is if someone is overtly racist, either in their tweets or their public remarks. I think that's very obvious to a lot of people. But another way someone can feel excluded is if they have a sign outside their house that says, "In this house, we believe that all races are welcome, but you cannot live next to me. I won't allow you to live next to me." And so I think right now it's sort of not really percolated, but I have a hard time believing in the future a group of kind of diverse immigrants and second generation are going to come in, try to live in communities, and you have incumbents that are primarily white incumbents that are saying, no, you can't live here next to us. I have a hard time believing that's not going to be a political issue. And the party that wins those issues are going to be in better shape. So
another question, I mean, just kind of as we look towards the bottom of the hour here and to wrap up, I mean, I'd be curious, you have two movements here that in many ways have had a lot of success, but I'd also be curious, now that obviously, it's still pretty early in Mayor Sim's term, we're only, around a year out from the school board recalls. I'd be curious if you all could just reflect a little bit, in kind of the early, these demands for change now that they've manifested in elections, what are the changes that's resulted in that you feel like have been, okay, this is what we fought for, and what are some of the unexpected challenges that these elections and these movements kind of have run into after their first big victories?
I think for Mayor Sim, it's this unbelievable level of electoral success he's had has set a really, really high level of expectation, and it's going to be very hard to meet those expectations. But when you start to sort of peel back the onion on what it is that won us the election and what it is that's going to actually drive the results that Lorraine will want to see in her neighborhood and what I'll want to see in my neighborhood, we ran on hiring 100 new police officers and 100 mental health nurses. 100 new police officers, we already have 1,600. So adding another 100, so what's that, 4 or 5% new police? Is that really going to have a dramatic impact on reducing crime? Probably not. Are the 100 mental health nurses going to help get more people help? Yes, it will have a positive impact. But is it going to make measurable differences in resolving some of these public safety issues? Likely not. The solution will require a significant ramp up investment from the provincial government in mental health and social support services, as well from the federal government as well too. And those are things that are going to be out of his hands. And so his success is going to be really tied to his ability to maintain a relationship with the premier and with the prime minister, and keep their focus and their commitment on Vancouver, which is hard when we have a federal election coming around just around the corner, and voter-rich Toronto is going to command more dollars than Vancouver. So the expectations are high. The limited resources of a city to deal with some of these issues aren't going to resolve the problem. And so as time goes on and the crime stats don't drop, I think the sheen on the win can easily come off.
I want to say that for our school board recall, you might know that I was appointed and served out the term to the end of last year, and I ran for my own term in November and lost. I lost by 0.6%, for about 4,000 votes out of 680,000 votes cast. So it was a narrow loss, but it was partially because I was completely a neophyte politician, campaign person, but partially because the side that lost to the recall, they really wanted to fight back, and that was their chance to fight back, and they really put a lot of effort in, and I didn't even know what was going on. And now that it's over, the election is over, the narrow moderate majority that I was part of became, now we have only 3 instead of 4. So the school board has by and large gone back to I would say not as dramatic performative politics as before, but it's going that way again. What's good is that at least I can see the Chinese community of parents and advocates are still at it, and they're more vocal than before because of the recall, and they've continued to be more engaged. Yet I personally can see that their efforts are going to take a long time to really drive any sort of change in the school district. And that's really partially, maybe in large part, due to why I'm starting a private school, is that while the system itself is so large, it's 50,000 students in the district, $1 billion budget. The superintendent that I helped to hire is a good guy. He's trying to make changes, but it's going to take him a long time to turn the ship. And then you have this board that is still, as I said, going back into its old ways. This system is going to take a while to right the ship. In the meantime, just every year kids go through. And we even have advocates who want to fix the public school district, but when it comes to their own children, they send them to private school, right? We want you to do the right thing, but if you can't do it, I'm going to look out for my own kids, right? So we do have lots of advocates who are trying to, hold the school district accountable, send their own kids to private school because they don't want to be the experiment. They don't want their kids to be the experiment. So this is really part of the reason I'm starting a private school, because the kids, while we're adults, are talking and taking years to affect some real change. The kids are going through, and this whole system is it's a Titanic is sinking. So it's pessimistic view, and this is why I didn't get involved in politics ever before in my life. Now that I touched it in a year and a half, I'm choosing to step out a little bit, maybe in a parallel lane, this education lane, and really try to do some good for educating our kids rather than being in the politics of education.
So I also feel like there's a whole issue of bureaucracy too, and change is going to take forever, because what we've seen here in Vancouver, it's been culminating for over 12 years. There's the ideology is entrenched. It's entrenched in the policies in our institutions, and it gets shifted over to the bureaucracy. And, even though we have a new council, we have a new mayor, it's going to take time. There's, policy that's already set in place. And, I agree with Anne. There's a lot of people out there that want to point out what's good for, public schools, and they send their kids to private school. We see this all the time. And, like you said, Anne, like they don't want their kid to be the experiment. But unfortunately, I feel like that's what's happening right now. We're seeing this across the board, especially after 2020. We see the kids that were, I guess, educated through digital means and through Zoom and Teams. But, the private school kids, they just went back and they continued on, right? It's the public school kids that suffered. So lots of stuff that needs to be happening. It's going to take a long time.
So I'll ask the last question here, which is, and I think we've kind of touched on this, but I'd like to kind of put it to you all more directly, which is kind of, as Neil talked about, these are, only 2 cities. There's a lot more cities out there. They're different in a lot of ways. But as you kind of reflect on both the kind of the victories and also now, what's happened since then, Kind of what would be your advice to community leaders, in other cities or at the state or national level? What do you feel like are big lessons learned, either mistakes made or things that went well that you feel like should be done again? What are some of the big pieces of advice you'd offer to close out?
For me, I've been active again, running campaigns for 25 years, and I've seen this over and over and over again. Racialized voices in the Canadian political system have been silenced for a really, really long time. Today, we spent a lot of time talking about the Chinese community, but there are other communities as well too that are way underrepresented. We have significant systemic racism issues, particularly when we talk about Canada's Indigenous populations. And so the warning to future politicians and current politicians is that if you're not paying attention to these problems, they will hit a boiling point, and you will become a victim of the tsunami that will eventually knock you out of office. And we haven't really done a good job as a society to really self-examine what's going on around us, and how we are able to raise these voices in a constructive manner and not have to have these blowout discussions that ramp up emotions and temperatures. There has to be some mechanism for our society to be able to address these issues before they hit those boiling points. It's not healthy for democracy to go through these wild swings in elections. They're important, of course, and they happen. But there are just too many communities out there that are way underrepresented, and I just really feel that my advice would be to spend a little bit more time looking beyond the safe, comfortable parts of your political party or your society or your network of friends, to look for the answers for how you should be spending your time as an elected official.
Also, I just wanted, as a community leader and other community leaders out there, you got to keep the pressure on. Just because, a new administration is in office, that doesn't mean you take your foot off the gas pedal. And these concerns, we need to just keep pressing on. I mean, change is going to take a while, but we can't let up. And, doubling down on what hasn't worked is not going to help, which I feel throwing more money at things, which I've seen all across the board, that's not going to help. If you don't clean up what's happening right now, nothing's going to get changed. More money is not going to change anything.
I want to say that I think politicians, I want to say the Chinese culture in general, disdains politicians. The Chinese people just want to, live a good life, have a nice family, and be comfortable. And it doesn't matter if there's an emperor in power or democratic government in power. As long as my life is good, I would say the majority. Okay, then I'm fine. And maybe that's not Chinese. Maybe it's just people in general. If my life is fine, and whichever government is in power, it doesn't even matter if it's autocratic or democratic or big D Democratic or big R Republican. It doesn't matter who's in office, as long as my life is good and my family's life, my friends, my day-to-day, my life is good. Doesn't matter to me. But when my life is being impacted by just the garbage on the street, because there's just homeless people everywhere that I walk, right? And the fact that my kid cannot even read when he or she's in 3rd grade. Okay, things like this that really impact me as a citizen, as a person in a society, then whoever is in power is going to be in trouble, right? It doesn't matter if it's a Democrat or Republican or common sense party or whatever party it is. So I really urge the politicians, the elected officials, to just ask the fundamental reason, why does a government exist? Is to make the lives of citizens better. And if you don't do that, you're going to be, it may take a while, but it's going to reach a boiling point and you're going to be overthrown. Whether it's the emperor that gets overthrown or the, whoever in power is going to get overthrown. So,
Neil, any final reflections on some of these lessons that folks are taking away?
Yeah, well, I hope the audience is getting a lot out of it. I certainly was. And I think you have a mixture in your audience of concerned citizens, political activists, and academics. Hopefully, all three groups can work together to address this important issue. I think this has been one of the most understudied topics and groups of people, especially given their importance. And I think one advice I would have to people who are looking at this, including the political professionals, is try to examine what kind of level of diversity you think is the most interesting and important. So one thing we've already talked about is, well, maybe Chinese American voters are different from South Asian voters or different from Filipino voters, and that could be the case, and that's good to study. I think another thing is, are the first generation immigrants who came in the late 60s, early 70s different from their children who are the second generation immigrants? And now we're going to get third generation immigrants. Are these people different from new people who have just come, not part of the first wave of immigration, but the more recent waves? To Kareem's point, people who are in mixed race relationships or the product of mixed race relationships are going to be increasing. And this is a very understudied group. And I think when you just try to, I think kind of everyone's going to have their unique features in this diaspora that we should study. And I'll just give you just one anecdote to give an example. So this is just a fun anecdote. They take it too seriously. But, you know, on Twitter, you see a lot of liberal people saying, oh, I can't believe I have a Tesla because I hate Elon. And I can't believe I bought a Tesla. And now I'm embarrassed to drive my Tesla around. And many Asian parents send their kids to these things like Kumon or Russian School of Mathematics or these kind of tutoring. I would just say the parking lots to drop off the kids are all Teslas. And not just a Tesla that begins with 8, which means you bought it before Elon became persona. Their license plates begin with 9, which means they just bought their Tesla. So I just think it's very fascinating to look at how maybe the experiences of people in some of our bubbles are different than the experiences of other bubbles. And I think curiosity and learning about different communities is kind of where we should go in the future.
All right. Unless anyone else has something to add, I will end it there. Thank you, all four of you, for your insights and your time today. It was just, for me, so fascinating to hear these kind of perspectives on what happened and hear directly from the folks involved. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And thank you to the audience for the great questions and for joining as well. And thank you as well to the Citron Center, to Eva Cito, who we have here, who helped us organize, as well as to BME at Berkeley and the Canadian Studies Center for co-sponsoring the team effort. And we really appreciate everyone's help. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.